1156 AD, the Venetian Republic facing war against the Byzantine Empire needed money immediately to build warships and hire soldiers, but had no gold in the treasury. So the government did something unprecedented in European history. It forced its wealthiest citizens to lend money to the state at 5% annual interest, with repayment promised from future tax revenues, creating the world's first government bonds called prestiti. And this system of forced loans that became tradable debt instruments financed Venetian expansion for 700 years, turning a city built on wooden pilings in a malaria-infested lagoon into the richest and most powerful maritime empire in medieval Europe, controlling trade between East and West. But here's what makes this story the blueprint for every modern government debt system. The prestiti weren't voluntary investments. They were compulsory extractions from wealthy Venetians who had no choice but to lend. The debt became hereditary, meaning your children inherited both the bond and the obligation to make future forced loans. The government never actually repaid the principal, but just kept paying 5% interest, forever creating a permanent creditor class living off government payments. And when Venice finally fell to Napoleon in 1797, after 7 centuries of dominance, the Republic collapsed not from military defeat, but from debt service, consuming so much revenue that it couldn't afford to defend itself, proving the pattern that every empire built on debt eventually dies from debt regardless of how long the system appears to work. This is the story of how Venice pioneered the debt-financed empire model that every modern government now uses, how forced loans created a captive creditor class that became permanently dependent on government interest payments, and thus supported endless war and expansion to generate the tax revenue to service their bonds. How the innovation of making debt tradable created the world's first secondary bond market, where wealthy Venetians could sell their forced loans to others at discount or premium, depending on confidence in government solvency. How this system allowed Venice to punch far above its weight, never more than 150,000 people controlling an empire spanning the Mediterranean, by leveraging debt to build fleets that a city of its size could never afford through taxation alone. And why the Venetian model proves that debt-financed empire expansion works brilliantly for centuries, until the mathematical certainty of compounding interest and accumulated debt makes collapse inevitable, because eventually debt service exceeds all possible tax revenue, and the empire can no longer afford the military that enforces the tax collection that services the debt that financed the empire. 700 years from first forced loan to Napoleon's conquest, the longest-running government debt system in history, and it ended exactly how empire debt always ends: bankruptcy disguised as military defeat. The prestiti system began in 1156 when Venice needed to finance war against Byzantium, but couldn't raise enough through normal taxation, because Venetian wealth was tied up in trade goods, ships, and overseas investments that couldn't be quickly liquidated. The Great Council, Venice's governing body of wealthy merchant families, passed a law requiring every citizen above a certain wealth threshold to lend money to the government at 5% annual interest, with loan amounts assessed based on property value and estimated wealth. This wasn't a request. It was a legal obligation enforced by the state with penalties for refusal, including property confiscation and loss of political rights. The initial loans totaled approximately 100,000 ducats, equivalent to building and equipping 20 warships, and the government promised repayment from future customs duties and taxes on trade. But here's the innovation that changed everything. In 1162, just 6 years after the first forced loan, the government made prestiti transferable, meaning a wealthy Venetian forced to lend 1,000 ducats at 5% could sell that bond to another investor if he needed liquidity, creating the world's first secondary market for government debt. This transferability was genius because it solved the creditor's liquidity problem. You're forced to lend, but you can sell the bond, while ensuring the government never had to actually repay principal because bonds just changed hands among creditors. The interest rate stayed at 5% regardless of who owned the bond, but the price at which bonds traded varied based on confidence in government solvency and Venice's military and economic fortunes. When Venice won wars and trade flourished, prestiti traded above par. You might pay 1,050 ducats for a bond, paying 5% on 1,000 ducats face value. When Venice faced defeats or threats, bonds traded at discount, maybe 900 ducats for that same 1,000 ducat bond. This created a market mechanism where wealthy Venetians constantly evaluated government creditworthiness and Venice's prospects, and bond prices became the earliest form of government credit rating. The forced loan system expanded rapidly as Venice's empire grew because each new war, each new territorial acquisition, each new fleet required financing that exceeded annual tax revenue. By 1200, outstanding prestiti totaled approximately 1 million ducats, 10 times the initial loans, and wealthy Venetians were obligated to make new forced loans every few years as the government's financing needs grew. By 1300, debt had reached 3 million ducats with annual interest payments consuming 15 to 20% of government revenue. By 1400, debt exceeded 6 million ducats. By 1500, debt reached 12 million ducats with interest payments consuming over 30% of revenue. The pattern was clear. Debt grew exponentially while tax revenue grew linearly, meaning an increasing share of every ducat collected in taxes went to interest payments rather than actual government operations or military spending. But here's why the system didn't collapse for 700 years. Venice controlled the most valuable trade routes in Europe connecting East and West, and customs duties on spices, silk, cotton, and luxury goods from Asia provided steady revenue that grew as trade volume increased. Venice's geographic position, controlling the Adriatic Sea and dominating Eastern Mediterranean trade, meant it could tax trade it didn't have to produce, extracting wealth from goods passing through Venetian-controlled ports. This rent extraction economy generated enough revenue to service growing debt for centuries, because trade kept expanding and Venice's naval power enforced its trade monopoly. Additionally, the creditor class was the same merchant class that controlled government, so they set tax policy to ensure their bonds got paid. Customs duties on imported goods were prioritized over everything else, and when revenue fell short, new forced loans were mandated to pay interest on old loans, creating a debt spiral disguised as sound finance. The hereditary nature of prestiti obligation is what made this debt bondage rather than investment. When a wealthy Venetian died, his prestiti holdings and his obligation to make future forced loans both passed to his heirs. Your father was forced to lend 10,000 ducats to the government. You now own bonds paying 500 ducats annually, and you're now obligated to make future forced loans when the government demands them. This created a permanent creditor class whose wealth depended on government solvency, whose political power depended on maintaining the system, and whose children inherited both the income and the obligation. It wasn't slavery in the traditional sense, but it was bondage. You were legally bound to lend to the government regardless of whether you believed the loans would be repaid, and your descendants were similarly bound in perpetuity. The only escape was to sell your prestiti at whatever price the market offered, and hope you weren't forced into new loans before you could liquidate your wealth and leave Venice. But the government controlled exit through capital controls and required permission to transfer large sums abroad. The system trapped wealthy Venetians into permanent financial relationship with the state where their interests aligned with government expansion, because empire generated the customs revenue that paid their interest. This alignment of elite interests with government debt service is the key to understanding why the prestiti system lasted 700 years. The people with power to change the system were the same people profiting from it, so they enthusiastically supported endless war, territorial expansion, and aggressive trade policies that maximized customs revenue even though the underlying mathematics of compounding debt made eventual collapse certain. The collapse began in the 1500s and accelerated through the 16 and 1700s as Venice's trade monopoly eroded and debt service consumed exponentially more revenue. The Portuguese discovery of sea routes around Africa to Asia in 1498 broke Venice's monopoly on eastern trade. Goods could now bypass Venetian-controlled Mediterranean routes, cutting customs revenue by 30 to 50% over 50 years. The Ottoman Empire's expansion captured former Venetian territories in the eastern Mediterranean, requiring expensive defensive wars that increased debt while reducing revenue from lost customs posts. Venice fought the War of the League of Cambrai from 1508 to 1516, costing 3 million ducats, added to prestiti debt, defending against a coalition of European powers trying to break Venetian trade dominance. The Republic won militarily, but was weakened economically. By 1500, annual interest payments on prestiti exceeded 40% of total government revenue. By 1600, debt service consumed 50% of revenue. By 1700, debt service took 60%, leaving inadequate funds for naval maintenance, military payroll, or infrastructure. Venice's fleet declined from 3,000 warships in the 14th century to 300 in the 17th century, not because Venice lacked shipbuilding capacity, but because debt service crowded out military spending. The government couldn't afford to build new ships because every ducat collected in taxes was pledged to bondholders. When Napoleon invaded in 1797 with French revolutionary armies, Venice couldn't mount effective defense because the treasury was empty despite still collecting millions in customs duties. The money went straight to interest payments. The Great Council voted to surrender without fighting and dissolved the Republic after 1,000 years of existence. Napoleon looted Venetian art and treasures, confiscated church property, and repudiated prestiti debt. 700 years of bonds declared worthless overnight, wiping out the wealth of Venice's creditor class that had financed and sustained the empire. This is the empire economy, where we decode the systems operating in plain sight but rarely explained honestly. Venice invented government bonds in 1156 by forcing wealthy citizens to lend at 5% interest, created the world's first tradable debt market in 1162, making prestiti transferable, and financed 700 years of empire expansion from a city never exceeding 150,000 people by leveraging debt to build fleets and armies far beyond what taxation alone could fund. The innovation was making wealthy citizens into permanent creditors, whose children inherited both bond income and obligation to make future forced loans, creating hereditary debt bondage, where creditor class interests aligned with government expansion. Because empire trade generated customs revenue that paid 5% interest on ever-growing debt that reached 12 million ducats by 1500. The system worked for centuries because Venice controlled trade choke points, extracting wealth from goods passing through Venetian-controlled ports. But mathematical certainty of compounding debt eventually made collapse inevitable. By 1700, 60% of all revenue went to interest payments, leaving nothing for military defense. And when Napoleon invaded 1797, Venice surrendered without fighting because debt service had consumed the treasury, proving the pattern that debt-financed empire expansion works brilliantly. Until debt service crowds out all other spending, an empire can no longer afford the military that enforces the taxation that services the debt. Modern parallel is exact. United States invented modern government bond market with permanent national debt, forces citizens to lend through monetary inflation that makes dollars worth less, while bonds pay fixed returns, created global system where creditors profit from government expansion, and now spends nearly $1 trillion annually on debt service, approaching 40% of revenue, exactly like Venice in 1500. With same mathematical trajectory toward point where debt service consumes so much revenue that military spending must decline until empire can't defend itself. The Venetian Republic lasted 700 years from first forced loan to Napoleon's conquest, longer than any empire built on debt has ever lasted, and it ended exactly how all debt empires end. Bankruptcy disguised as military defeat because treasury was empty from paying bondholders. Venice pioneered the model, proved it works for centuries, and demonstrated why it ultimately fails when exponential debt growth exceeds linear revenue growth, and mathematics makes collapse inevitable regardless of how powerful empire appears. 700 years of debt bondage built the richest medieval empire, and then destroyed it exactly as compound interest mathematics predicted it would.